Today we're going to look at the sheep brain, and this is a sheep brain that still has the Dura Mater on the surface, and you can see through the Dura Mater. And if I turn that around and you can see the inferior view of the brain, when you have the Dura Mater intact, usually you have much longer optic nerves showing, and here's the optic chiasm, and also they kind of cut around the sphenoid bones so that they still have a pituitary attached to the inferior brain. So this is the pituitary gland on the sheep brain. When the brain does not have a Dura Mater present, it looks like this. And so this brain lacks a Dura Mater, but what you see, that kind of shiny structure that is on the outside of the brain, is the arachnoid. So the dura sits on top of the arachnoid, but the dura has been removed, and so this glistening cover that you see here is the arachnoid, the second meningeal layer. Now, when we look at an inferior view of a brain that lacks a Dura Mater, typically you don't see a pituitary gland on the brain because it's been taken off with the Dura Mater. So what you do see here is where the optic nerves have been cut, and I can see a little bit of this optic nerve on the left side of the brain here. The optic chiasm would be right there, and the optic tracts go back to their respective areas of the brain. If you look at an inferior view of the whole brain that doesn't have a Dura Mater, you can see olfactory bulbs are very large in the sheep brain. And then coming back at an angle here would be the olfactory tract. And here is where the optic nerves were cut, and the optic chiasm is right there. And these would be the optic tracts. This is the mammillary body, and unlike in the human, where you have two rounded structures making up the mammillary bodies, the mammillary body in the sheep looks like a single structure. This little recessed area is where the infundibulum was and was attached to the pituitary gland, but since the pituitary gland has been removed, all you see left behind is this kind of little hole here. On either side of the mammillary body, here and here, would be the midbrain, and these more specifically are called the cerebral peduncles of the midbrain. The cerebral peduncles contain ascending and descending nerve fiber tracts. As we go down further, we come to the pons, and the pons is very, very small in the sheep brain. Unlike in the human, the pons is quite large. And then when you get to the medulla oblongata of the sheep brain, that is very pronounced. So here is our sheep brainstem. We have midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. And notice how the orientation of the sheep brain, the brainstem is more horizontal, it's in the transverse plane, and in the human it would be more vertically oriented. So there's a different orientation to that part of the brain as well. So I'm going to turn this around, and again we can see that arachnoid layer there, and in the back of the brain here we can see the cerebellum, and the longitudinal fissure is right here, separating the right and the left cerebral hemispheres. And another interesting part of the brain that we can see when we gently pull down on the cerebellum is the posterior part of the midbrain, which is known as the corpora quadrigemina. Right here are your superior colliculi, and here are your inferior colliculi. And this little thing that is sitting right at the top of the superior colliculi, that is your pineal gland. So these four structures, the two superior colliculi and the two inferior colliculi, make up what is known as the corpora quadrigemina of the midbrain. So that is the posterior aspect of the midbrain. So be really careful, because notice how the brainstem is kind of tearing here. And you want to just be real careful that you don't break that off while you're looking at these structures. You can see the gyri here, the little ridges on the cerebrum. And because we have an arachnoid covering, I can't really stick my probe in there, but the sulcus would be the little shallow groove between the gyri. So the gyri are the ridges, and the little grooves are the sulci. And now back to our mid-sagittal view. One thing that you can see right away is our corpus callosum, our kind of C-shaped structure that contains nerve fibers that allow the right and left cerebral hemispheres to communicate with each other. And then what I can see like right in here is going to be that septum pellucidum. And if you can get through that, and I'm not going to tear this because it looks too nice, I'll just go back to this one where the septum pellucidum is no longer intact. But if you kind of lift up on that corpus callosum, the space in there is your lateral ventricle. So the lateral ventricle lies under the corpus callosum and on the other side of that septum pellucidum. Now going back to this brain, another structure that we can see kind of extending towards the corpus callosum is the fornix. And so the fornix kind of lies over top of this round structure called the thalamus. So the thalamus is here. It's part of the diencephalon. And below the thalamus we have the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus doesn't really have much of a shape to it, but it's just going to be this relatively flat area below the thalamus. Behind the thalamus, posterior to the thalamus, we have our pineal gland, which is quite pronounced in a sheep brain. And so pineal gland is for sleep-wake cycles, your daily rhythms, and so that's the gland right there. So our diencephalon region is right here, and it consists of the hypothalamus, the thalamus, and the pineal gland. We looked at in another video the superior and inferior colliculi, and here they are mid-sagittally. Here's one superior colliculus, and here's the inferior colliculus, and that's the posterior part of the midbrain. Now, when you're looking at a mid-sagittal view, the other thing that you want to take note of is optic chiasm has been cut. This is where the pituitary would have been, and this is where your mammillary body would be. Now, this shows the cerebral aqueduct because this cut of the brain was right along the midline. So here's your cerebral aqueduct, and you can see the superior colliculus here and the inferior colliculus right along here.